Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and as always, I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to move forward through yet another training camp together. As always, you can always find our 100% free, 24/7 boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars when you follow us on social media such as Facebook or Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I was live once again, boots on the ground, covering the Jacksonville Jaguars in Miami, South Florida, for Thursday's joint practices against the Miami Dolphins. Now, I think, honestly, a lot of context is kind of required for this joint practice, and I'll start breaking it down why before I get into what I actually saw. So, I get the feeling that this was a little bit of, I don't want to say learning experience, but I do think it can help the Jaguars navigate how they want to do joint practices moving forward. I mean, the Miami Dolphins have had joint practices, I think, 2 weeks in a row before this one. They had one with the Bears. They had one with the Detroit Lions. And it just very much seemed like from whether it's the fact that it was only one day of joint practices, it's not scheduled for tomorrow, or really how, in my opinion, the practice kind of went, kind of seemed like the Dolphins were more or less, ready to get through this practice. That they had already gotten their work in joint practices in the weeks before. And I understand that. It is a preseason week 3 training camp week. The most useless week of training camp each and every year. And I think that the Jaguars, moving forward, one, maybe they don't try to schedule a week 3 joint practice, or two, maybe they don't do it with a team that had so many others on the schedule. But on the flip side of that, I understand the Jaguars wanted to find a joint practice this year, and their most sensible option was always Miami. The other two preseason teams, the Saints and the Steelers, Miami was just always the more sensible option for them. So, to me, that played a big part in the practice. I think, Pete Prisco said it best. So it looked like two teams that were over training camp. And I agree with that to a large extent. With that said, there was still a lot of good work in between the teams. And, we'll just go offense first and defense. So you start off, obviously, there's no Travis Hunter. He's still working his way back, from his injury. Liam Cohen said after practice that, if it was week 1 versus the Panthers, he probably would have played in the game. But it just, there's no point in risking anything with Travis Hunter right now. He went to individual drills at wide receiver, and then he worked off to the side. Tyson Campbell did same thing at cornerback. And it's kind of the same thing we've been seeing from them the last couple of days. So I expect both to play week 1 against Carolina, in part because, teams call injuries precautionary measures a lot of times. It really does seem like these are precautionary for the Jaguars. It really does seem like that these are issues that, they don't think are necessarily dire, but there's also no point in risking them in a practice that, at the end of the day, doesn't count. So no Travis Hunter, no Tyson Campbell. We'll start with the offense first. I thought the offense had a sloppy day. And I know, most people on Twitter, they're going to see that Trevor Lawrence threw 2 interceptions. One to Minkah Fitzpatrick, one to Jack Jones. And they're probably going to he and ha and whatnot about it. To me, the only position group that I thought looked concerning was the offensive line. I thought the offensive line had a lot of issues with Miami. I mean, Zach Zeitler, my apologies if I mispronounce his name, he looked like Aaron Donald out there. He was living in the Jaguars' backfield. And outside of one Bayshal Tootin run, it didn't seem like the running game had that much momentum. And then, to me, this was more specific to the passing game, but Liam Cohen was very good on this topic when it came to the Jaguars in the passing game. He simply noted that, they were seeing a very different defensive structure and coverage scheme than they've seen at any other point in training camp, at any point in the preseason. And you only get one practice with this. It's not like you can game plan for it. It's not like you're reviewing film to prepare for a joint practice. But ultimately, I think that, just seeing the different coverages that the Dolphins had, and like I said, Liam was very good on it. He said some defenses can show man coverage and then actually play a zone. Some show zone and then actually play man. And that's kind of what they were running into when it came to the Dolphins' defense, in my opinion. It just looked like miscommunication. Like on the interception to Minkah Fitzpatrick, it wasn't oh my God, what is Trevor Lawrence seeing? Why is he throwing that ball kind of interception? It looked like he expected for Britton Strange to sit on the route. And Britton Strange just kept running across the field. And, if Trevor Lawrence had been thinking that this ball was going across the field, Britton Strange would have been open. He would have been open if he sat in the soft zone too. But he didn't, so the ball goes to Minkah Fitzpatrick. And nobody is looking for the context of that. All they see is Trevor Lawrence interception, which I understand. Fans are going to fan. Pundits are going to pundit. I get that. On the other interception to Jack Jones, it looked like it was very similar. It just looked like him and the receiver were expecting each other to do something differently. So I didn't think it was a day where Trevor Lawrence was just spraying the ball. He had some nice throws. He had two really good ones to Brian Thomas. One was like a 45-yard post. And to me, if there was one bad ball from Trevor Lawrence, it was, one in the final period of the practice where he had Parker Washington down the seam wide open, and he just overthrew him a little bit. And even that one, Liam Cohen said, a piece of that had to do with the coverage that the Dolphins were playing. Coverage the Jaguars haven't seen under Liam Cohen. So I think if you had 2 or 3 days of joint practices, the Jaguars offense probably looks better on day 2 and 3. But they only get the one, and it is what it is. I think Brian Thomas Jr., though, was absolutely dominant. I thought Brian Thomas Jr. had a great practice. He is one of those guys, you just see a different side out of him when you get into competitive situations like these joint practices, like regular season games. If you guys remember, Brian Thomas Jr. really started to stack together good days in last year's training camp after the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had come in for joint practices. It was during those joint practices where you started to see a different version of Brian Thomas. And to me, that's kind of the version of Brian Thomas that we saw on Thursday. Now, has Brian Thomas had a good training camp? I think if you're going by Brian Thomas standards, I think the answer is no. That's not to say Brian Thomas is going to struggle or anything like that, because he had a very similar, if not exactly the same, training camp a year ago. But it is to say, in my opinion, that there are always reasons and context behind things. And when you see him just flip that switch and become a different guy, when there's a different team on the field and when it's a more competitive setting, I think that says it all. And I think that's a good thing for the Jaguars. It's much better for Brian Thomas Jr. to drop a pass during day 16 of training camp and then go out there in week 1 and dominate than it would be for him to catch everything that's thrown his way during training camp and the preseason and then show up as a dud in the regular season, which we've seen happen. Now, that's for the other side of the ball. I thought the Jaguars' defense, similar to what Miami's defense did to Jacksonville's offense, I thought the Jaguars' defense absolutely whooped Miami. They were prepared for the RPOs. Tua had to hold the ball a lot on those. Jarian Jones had a really good day, in my opinion. He made several nice plays on the ball, including one on RPO. You also saw Christian Braswell with a pass deflection. You saw Jordan Lewis make some nice stops. But what I was most impressed by was the defensive front. Josh Hines-Allen and Trayvon Walker lived in the Dolphins' backfield, people. Absolutely lived. And it seemed like there was nothing the Dolphins could do to stop them. And the Dolphins tried a few trick-like plays, where there's a handoff and then a pitch, etc. And Josh Hines-Allen stuffed it out twice. One time it would have been a fumble return for a touchdown. And it wasn't just him and Trayvon. I thought Devon Hamilton had a good day in terms of getting pressure. Devin Lloyd got home on a blitz. And then Eric Armstead had a fantastic practice in terms of getting penetration and pressure. So I thought the Jaguars' defense handily won against Miami. I thought Miami's defense won against the Jaguars. But if you're asking to me which defense was more dominant, I'm going with the Jaguars. And that is exactly what I saw in Miami at Jaguars joint practices.